All right, so here is the coolant tank that exploded on me on my drive. And the process to remove this involves taking off an electrical connector. You need to pinch both sides, not the top side, but both sides. Pinch it out, get these two hoses up top here. Hose number one, let me zoom in. Hose number two, here. And then finally, let me flip this around. Hose number three, this is the return line for the rest of the system that goes back to the water pump. So those are the main hoses that you need to go and remove. But of course, once you start this, make sure to drain as much coolant out as you can, as much as possible from this tank. As you can see, I've already installed the new tank, and the process to actually get this tank off the brackets involves two screws here. There's one screw here. Down there, there's another screw. Let's see here. Down there, you unscrew it, so you'll be able to like take off this bracket that's holding the tank to the side. Now there is another bracket that's holding the tank to the bottom. All you need to do is once you take this bracket off, you simply slide it out. I think you slide it out this way, and then you'll be able to maneuver and have access to the tank, so you'll be able to take off these hoses, the connectors, and as well as that bottom return hose here. If you are doing this by yourself, I highly recommend you get this tool. This is a hose clamp tool that locks as you squeeze, and it will expand the lock rings on those hoses, so you'll have two hands to be able to take off those three hoses. So highly recommend you get yourself a pair of these before you even start the job. I also forgot to mention there is a reinforcement bracket that outlines the tank here. You're gonna need to transfer that from your old tank to your new tank. Around here, it's just held on by one 10mm screw, and it's pretty simple, straightforward job. This reinforcement bracket actually helps the tank stay closed if and when this explodes. So that was a recall that the Audi R8s had, because these coolant tanks started to explode from the seam here, and then they actually and these tanks basically just ripped apart. Now, there is a modification or a hack to help preserve this tank from exploding again, because the coolant temperature that is returning into this expansion tank is really, really hot. Over time, the seams will actually start to break. So there is a way, there's a hack. I'm not gonna do it on my car, but in the later video, I'm going to show you in theory how you would do it yourself. So stay tuned for that video. So this car is about 16 years old. I'm not sure whether this car has had an entire coolant flush. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to drain the entire system and then flush it with brand new coolant. Now, if you're certain that your coolant is okay, it's fairly good, you could just go ahead and button everything up and then top the entire system off with coolant, run the engine, and then any small air bubbles should eventually air out naturally. Now, the first step to drain your coolant is to jack up the car so you can access two ports that you will need to drain the coolant. One port is by underneath the engine. The other port is in front of the car by the radiators. And if you have a V10 version, okay, not a V8, there is another drain port that you also need to drain on the other side of the engine. So there's one drain port on the left side of the engine, and there's another drain port on the right side of the engine for the V10 versions. So once you jack up the car and you take off the engine pan, that plastic pan that is covering the engine down here, you're gonna see this part right here. This is part of the thermostat / water pump. And this big black part here is the drain port for the engine, for the V8s as well as the V10s. So what you need to do, this is a screw here. So you need to go get a big Phillips or a flathead. You go in here and then you loosen it and then proceed to drain the engine side of all the coolant here. Now, as I mentioned before, the V10s have another drain port on the other side of the engine. This is actually the left side of the engine. If you go over here, imagine there is a part here that runs alongside this engine here, and there is one drain port somewhere around here. I'm going to show you where that drain port is in the next scene. And here is a diagram for the second drain plug that V10 owners need to drain. You can see right here, this is the other drain plug. And where is it located? Let's follow the arrow right here. It is located on the right side of the engine here. And to help orient yourself here, this is the front side of the car. And then right here is towards the rear of the car. You can see here that on the right side of the engine, there is this drain port for the coolant for the V10 engines for the Generation 1 Audi R8. You can also see why it's on the right side of the engine is because, as you can see here, I'm going to circle this part right here. This is the oil pump, and the oil pump sits on the left side of the engine. All right, so you got to give it quite some time for the engine side to drain. It's been around 15 to 20 minutes already, and it's still draining, albeit at a slow drip. But yeah, I would say give it probably 15 to 20 more minutes until it's barely dripping, and then you'll be able to go ahead and screw that screw in to that drain port with the new O-ring, and just make sure it's hand tight. Don't go crazy on this thread here. So here's the screw for the drain plug on the thermostat side. It should come with an O-ring right here, and the service manual says that if you are going to use your existing screw, you need to replace the O-ring. Well, I could not find the specs for this O-ring, so I just went ahead and bought the entire screw that comes with an O-ring. It's worth a couple of dollars. It's not worth my time trying to figure out what O-ring to order once I got the screw out. But if you want to use your existing screw and just get a new O-ring, here are the dimensions. The dimensions of the O-ring is outer diameter 3.9 millimeters, so about 14. Inner diameter 10.3 millimeters. And the thickness is around 2 millimeters. So you're welcome, Internet. So now we need to drain the radiators. What you need to do is take off the plastic panel towards the front of the car. So that will expose this radiator hose right here on the left side of the car. What you need to do is take off that hose with that clamp you see here. Take it off and then start draining it all the way. And then it should drain all 3 radiators if you drain it using this hose here. So in order to fill the system with coolant, apply a vacuum on the entire system so it will suck all the coolant in and get rid of most of the air bubbles in the system. It's a really good way to prevent a lot of air bubbles that would otherwise be in the system if you were to just simply fill up the coolant tank with a funnel. So how this device works, and I got this device at Harbor Freight, is to apply shop air into the tool. It will pull a vacuum, and then once the vacuum has been pulled, it goes up to around negative 25 HSI around here. Once you have that, and you simply pull on the lever that is attached to this clear hose right here. See this lever right here. You open that valve, and then it will suck coolant all the way from this end hose right here. So when you do that, just make sure that you have a nice bucket with plenty of coolant, because it will suck that coolant up really fast. You should not ever be sucking coolant when this is exposed to air, because otherwise you're going to be putting air into the system. So let's assume that you have done this. You filled the entire system with coolant, and it will take around 3 to 4 gallons really initially. So just be prepared to have around 3 or 4 gallons of this ready on hand. So once you filled your entire system with coolant, you now need to go to the front of the car, take off this plastic trim piece with 2 quarter turn screws, and then bleed let's see here, let's zoom in, bleed this valve right here. What you need to do is, it's just held on by a clip. Once you unlodge it from its mounting point, there is a hose clamp. Take off this hose clamp, and then you could then push this silver piece out of the hose here. And it's quite long. It's kind of, I think it's like, and it's like around an inch length, this silver hose here for this bleeder screw here, for this bleeder valve. You basically pry this out, and then air will come rushing out and fill out this tube with coolant. Once you see coolant out of this hose, you just plug this hose back in, put the hose clamp back on, and then just reposition the breather valve. So let's assume that you filled up the entire system with coolant. The next step is to actually go through the bleed procedure dictated by the factory service manual. So in order to start the bleed procedure, you need to turn on the engine and turn on the heater core, disable the air conditioning, and then run the engine at 2,000 RPM for 3 minutes. 3 minutes. From there, you let the engine idle until the coolant hoses in the center of the vehicle are warm. After that, you run the engine at 2,000 RPM for 1 minute, and then turn off the engine and allow the system to cool. And as you're running the engine, make sure that you check for leaks underneath the car. Make sure that there is nothing leaking out of that drain hole, as well as that big radiator hose in front, and you should be golden. After you allow the engine to cool down a little bit, you can then open up the reservoir cap over there that you see here, and then top off with any extra coolant that you may need. And once you confirm that everything is a-okay, you've topped off the coolant, you just then go ahead and clean up and install these lower body panels here. Of course, if you appreciate this content, I will appreciate the like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.